perhaps one of the reasons that reading it as we have kind of takes us perhaps to another time, while at the same time remaining very much in the present. So I've just prepared a few words here that I would like to read out. So congratulations again. This is a vital contribution to our understanding of not just value, but of living processes, and indeed throughout the world. And I think your contribution could not be more timely, as this world that we live in continues to outdo itself in its indefatigable devaluing of life through these incessant through the incessant anthropogenic damage of our time. So whether in the form of a damaged planet, insectageddon, stratified forms of livability, or the rampant discrimination and marginalization that we face all over the world. So I really think, Stefan, your theory of value, as you write, can help us understand what forms of valuation that are at stake in the world that we live in today. And you, as you put it, your theory of value can be quite simply stated. And I quote here, life values living, valuing is what all living beings doing. And to study such valuing processes that are so intrinsic to the life, you propose later on in the book this form of ethnography that you and a colleague have coined as habitography, as a kind of more accurate description of what we as anthropologists are doing these days in the different fields that we work in, with these keen eyes to habituated dispositions that can help us to understand, for example, in your case, how and why people take the pharmaceutical drugs or Ayurvedic preparations they do. So indeed, I couldn't help but read Living Worth alongside your previous book, Eating Drugs. And I found myself thinking here that, wow, we have a phenomenal vitalist who isn't quite prepared to give up on the social quite yet. And perhaps I even found myself thinking, maybe this is the theory of value that arises when an anthropologist such as yourself has spent so much time learning about and immersing yourself into the Vedic worlds of prana, of Monika Kabar, and so forth. So I find a kind of life force reading of value here that I think absolutely is coming from the work that you've done in India. So very briefly, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, Stefan takes us quite meticulously and systematically through, dare I say, as I put it, this equational theory of value, which goes something like this. To live means to value means to compare. Comparing takes place through biocommensuration. Biocommensuration compares two entities to determine their relative worth, which is to say, which is better at enhancing life and thereby becoming meaningful as relevant to life. So you can see there's a kind of mathematical equation here at stake, and you'll have to revisit the book to kind of delve into each of those steps. But put in another way, you write that lively matters are valued towards pragmatic goals. So in this way, your theory of value adds really this vitalist dimension to these existing subjective theories of value, labor theories of value, and the very much in vogue approaches that attend to social process of valuation, as you're insisting really that valuing takes place prior to language, prior to social relations, because it is inherent to life in this kind of vitalist way. So why did I say that I found that you still haven't quite given up on the social yet, since you're insisting that this is taking place prior to the social? Well, I think it's because I still have this sneaking suspicion that perhaps these determinations of relative worth, which come later on in your equation, so to say, as to the determinations of relevance to life and the meaningfulness, are nevertheless still so entangled in our social lives that these are not only prior to, but perhaps still very much an intrinsic part of valuing, even though the theory itself is saying something else. But I sense that tension. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And then very finally, just for those readers who haven't had the chance to have a look yet, your chapters really take us, use this kind of field work in philosophy, as you put it, building on Paul Rabinow's kind of thinking here, that using your field work to think these things through, that you cover the so-called depression epidemic in India, your work on therapeutic pluralism, Gleevec patent battles, the formation of global mental health movements, and you really use these in innovative ways to try to think about what a theory of value might look like in today's world. And very finally here, perhaps the one sentence that I was struck by very particularly was this one. You write, I think it's in the first chapter, life finds itself worthy of living. And life wants to be as well and as healthy as possible. And that's that vitalist kind of a sense that life is always looking for ways to live well. I do have, coming back to my very first comments here, the question that I'll leave you with is that, you know, given the constraints within which many forms of life, and perhaps when we speak of human life, although the theory applies to other than humans as well, given the many constraints that so many vast amounts of life in the world, especially human lives, but all kinds of life, find themselves in, this desire or this want to be as well and as healthy as possible, it does raise very kind of important questions about, you know, perhaps we are at that moment where everything possible is being done to make that as difficult as possible. And what does that then do to your theory? And I'll leave it there. Thank you again for allowing me to read and to reflect on the book. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate it. Good. So we're going to move through all the four talks in a row, and then I'm going to try to respond. So I would like to call next on Junko Kitanaka, who joins us from Tokyo.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and for writing such a beautiful book. I mean, we've been reading this in our seminar, and we've been so inspired. It really creates new kind of energy to our ethnographic project. So let me read out, and I'm so glad Ayo did a wonderful talk on the theory of value. So I'm going to be focusing more on global health. So by engaging with the changing meaning of depression as an ailment that turns life against itself, Living Worth offers a profound anthropological meditation on the meaning of value and what it means to live a valued life. This book is a treasure box of intriguing theories and concepts, but I want to focus here on today is Stefan's brilliant analysis of the global mental health movement and its key paradox, that is, that the global scaling up of intervention might well have scaled up the suffering as well. In analyzing this, Stefan first of all points out that behind the alleged global rise of depression lies the fact that global psychiatry has been drastically transformed into a powerful and profitable economic enterprise. And this happened after the deinstitutionalization movement from the 1970s, which helped expand the market economy for developing and distributing psychotropics more widely. More recently, global mental health did much to further turn psychotropics into an essential aspect of so many people's lives. Based on an ethnographic analysis of psychiatry in India and elsewhere, Stefan describes how the logic of care that values population health came to be overshadowed by the expanding influence of pharmaceutical corporations that prioritize the logic of profitability. As those corporations assert a certain kind of universal values through corporate social responsibility, which is presented as something ethical and humane, when in fact they are marketing and lobbying in disguise. Most troubling of all is the fact that a diagnosis of depression and psychotropics are being offered, as Stefan elucidates, to society's poor as a means for them to escape their social marginalization. So Stefan problematizes how implicit in GMH is the assumption that modernization bringing economic growth and accumulated wealth can be a cure for mental illness, but never a cause of it. That GMH should have so wholeheartedly embraced this idea, this economic rationale, is rather curious, given the fact that since the 1970s, the WHO's international epidemiological surveys have repeatedly questioned this assumption, which has led the WHO to emphasize both the cultural and social determinants of mental illness, thereby highlighting the influence of structural environmental factors over individual neurobiology. This all seems to have changed with GMH, as Stefan points out, as GMH is mainly comprised of epidemiology, economics, and service provision, it has stripped the culture concept of its complex and potentially therapeutic implications, and instead reduced it to such negative attributes as stigma and barriers to care. Yet this change, really a kind of optimism about biological determinism, has not been validated, as Stefan documents. And this is a point that's not widely known. The DMH confidence in psychotropics seems to have peaked in the early 2000s and was quickly replaced by the realization that drug-based care is not necessarily the best treatment for depression. So in thinking about the impasse that global psychiatry finds itself in, Stefan points out the fact that the culture of the DSM-GMH enterprise has not been adequately analyzed. And this is so unfortunate, particularly now that the psychiatry is evidently at war with itself, disturbed by forces from within. This can be seen in the rise of RDoC, the massive exodus of pharmaceutical companies from the development of psychotropics, and the growing doubts about the potentials of brain research. In other words, psychiatry has failed to achieve the kind of biocommensurability that is expected of scientific medicine, particularly now as there is a strong incentive to keep patients in chronic treatment, as science and industry have come to be so intimately entangled, as Stefan points out. The section of Living Worth that particularly stands out for me, and I keep coming back to this, is where Stefan criticizes the global monoculture of happiness of the DSM-GMH enterprise that remains strongly culture-bound. Stefan shows how the Hindu philosophy is in direct opposition to this sort of American, US, UK notion of happiness that promotes the idea that happiness is achieved through immersing oneself in social connectedness. Hindu philosophy instead preaches the idea that transcending social connectedness, not immersion in it, is the ultimate path towards salvation. I see resonance with this in the Buddhist thinking that I found among people with depression in Japan. So I've written a lot more, but just let me say that, I mean, Stefan is really never the one to shy away from raising the most fundamental questions. So he reminds us where anthropology began as a discipline strongly committed to examining both human universals and local specifics. Living Worth points us towards an anthropology reinvigorated by intellectual energy that asks questions about what matters most in life and what is really worth thinking about. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Joko. Thank you. Wonderful comments, and good. I'm gonna just hand over next to Brandon, who's gonna join us from Washington, and I am looking for you.
Yes, can I popping up now? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, and we can see. Oh, there, wait.
Okay. Great. Well,
yeah, here you are. Hi, everyone.
Thanks so much. And I think this is working out really well because we're each taking different angles towards this fantastic book. So first, Stefan, thanks so much for the opportunity to join today and to speak about your book. I really do think this is such an important text because the challenges that you lay out, we've in the field of psychiatry have been dealing with for decades and decades. And as you point out, I think very rightly, the situation has not gotten better. In many ways has gotten worse. So we need to take a different lens and time to reflect on this. So I'm going to come at this both, I guess, triple identities as a medical anthropologist, a global mental health practitioner, and a practicing psychiatrist in the US. So I can find, all kinds of challenges across the fields. So as I mentioned, this is so timely and so important. The Lancet Commission on Depression that was just released a few months ago highlighted that there's been really no change, that if you look at something like cardiovascular disease, almost a 30% drop in the global burden of disease over the past 3 decades, whereas total flat line in terms of depression, in terms of improvement. So despite both, some different types of changes in treatment, this idea of increasing access and scale, both in high income and low middle income countries, we have not seen the needle change. So we need to take time to reflect on why that's happening and take different approaches. You're very prescient in the final chapters in many ways. Wanted to point out in terms of your signaling that RDoC may be a blip in this approach to something different. I was on experience in being part of the culture group for the first time on this DSM-5 revision, working under Roberto Luis Fernandez for the culture section. And although there was some update to the cultural sections that you critique in Living Worth, it's pretty much just more of the same, trying to be a little bit more detailed. However, there was a chance for other changes on culture, and not the kind of including objects and psychopharmacology, the non-starter, unfortunately, in terms of that. But there was this idea that in terms of the so-called kind of evidence to justify this, can we put it in more context? So when claims are made throughout the DSM, that we in the culture group were tasked going through all the other sections to be able to say, what is the evidence? What is the support behind these statements? And it was so interesting for me. I mean, two things kind of stood out, or two disorders really stood out. One was reactive attachment disorder and reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder. And if you look at these two conditions in the DSM, they're almost exclusively in Romanian orphanage populations from the 80s and 90s. And why that's not a culture-bound disorder, you have more, cases of fear of penis retraction around the world than you do these conditions documented in Romanian orphans. But because of the person who did the research on it, and I think the high emphasis back to this idea of the biocommensurability, that we can biologically profile those conditions, they get prominence. So we really tried to introduce language into those conditions about the specificity, and for the most part, that was rejected. In other sections, we tried to also look at what's the rationale, and it's interesting, whenever we pointed out that this was seen in Australian populations or Danish populations or white European descent American populations, they were happy to put that, but then when we pointed out that this might have been seen in a sub-Saharan African population, which again is a huge group, or a South Asian population, it was reinterpreted in the text as other cultures. So it continues to kind of really struggle with this ideas of making claims around universality and trying to flavor culture in there as like, well, it's one piece of universality. And I wanted to tap that into the excellent observation I think you made about the rural practitioners in India, and compare that to at least kind of American psychiatrists, that for, at least from my experience, American psychiatrists and the psychiatric system, it's about the diagnosis. That is what the emphasis on. That's what your specialty is, that you are judged based on your ability to map onto this book, which, as you rightly point out, has nothing about treatment. Whereas your discussions about rural practitioners, in your prior book, discussions about pharmacists, my own experience working in Nepal, is these individuals are judged on, does the individual get better? Does the patient get better, right? So who cares what the diagnosis is? If I give the drugs that make you feel better, I am considered successful. We see that if you look at surgeons, if you look at especially like fertility specialists, they'll advertise how many babies they brought into the world. We, as a mental health professional in the high income country in the US, there's no numbers out there for how many cases of depression I've cured or treated or gotten better. So that value is put on diagnosis more so than actually the outcomes. And just to end on one point, is I think this emphasis on diagnosis and kind of processes has really, I think, driven the genetics and neuroscience to think about how can we understand these conditions, but not actually find ways to better characterize them in terms of the alleviation of suffering being the end goal. And it was perfectly summed up by Tom Insel about his own work, saying that, the genetic code is far inferior to the zip code or the postal code to actually understand who's experiencing suffering. And I wanted to kind of bring it full circle and end, with something you brought up at the end of the book, which is, Insel's approach now is to go to big data, right? And him saying that, well, we're going to drop genes, but we're going to get the big data. And what I think is such an important moment, and why I think your book can be pivotal here, is that this big data that he is talking about in terms of, online behavior, but also things like passive sensing, ecological momentary assessment, all these types of things, these are by no means exclusively in the province of the mental health professionals. And seeing more and more anthropologists take up these forms of ways of understanding life, we are in a unique position to have access to this same exact information, whereas anthropologists didn't have exactly information to the clinical encounter, I would say, in the same way as before. And what would a habitography of these other types of knowing using these big data look like, driven by social science, biocommensurability, and other types of theories and looking at the world to really crack open the failures of psychiatry that you outline so well at the end of the book. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That was a fantastic set of things, and also for your insights straight from the front lines of where psychiatry and transcultural psychiatry and DSM is nowadays. Fantastic. So I'm gonna hand over to our last speaker, Anne Pollock, who's gonna join us from London. Over to you, Anne. Hi.
So thank you so much. And like Brandon, I'm really struck by the ways in which all of us are capturing really distinct and diverse elements within the book, which I think attest to its very richness. For me, a core aspect of drugs that has always fascinated me is their capacity to carry both matter and meaning. So that is, they change our bodies on a molecular level, and at the same time, they also do semiotic work. And as an STS scholar with a particular interest in race, gender, and colonialism, I'm attuned to how pharmaceuticals become sites of constructing and contesting identity and difference on a simultaneously social and biological level. So in this tremendously rich book, Stefan provides fresh insight into how that manipulation of both matter and meaning happens through drugs, both in India in particular and in transnational pharmaceutical flows. So he does this with a particular attention to value, which I think he usefully highlights as both embodied and economic. That value is at stake for pharmaceutical consumers and for pharmaceutical makers in our inter-articulating ways. A core insight that comes through is that pharmaceutical companies alone do not control meaning making, but that meaning making can travel in unexpected ways. So right from the opening of the book, which introduces us to Indian interlocutors, such as a middle-class man who takes fluoxetine for a bad habit of greedy eating rather than for depression, and a gastroenterologist who prescribes tranquilizers because treating the brain is essential to treating the stomach, Calcuttans are creating new meanings for these drugs as they use them in unconventional ways. So a particularly fascinating element of the book is that Stefan brings this into relationship with plural articulations of drugs within pharmaceutical companies as well. This really comes to the fore for me in chapter 4, Making a Difference, Corporate Social Responsibility, in which pharmaceutical companies are rendered as hierarchical. So that is, that Ecks provocatively argues that for pharmaceutical companies, different sources of value, including both profit and ethics, are related to each other in a way that is not simply hierarchical. So here, I think my reading is slightly different from Juko's, because I think that there's actually also a challenge here to conventional anti-capitalist critiques of pharmaceuticals that decry the pharmaceutical companies' claims to care about health, because of course they ultimately care about their bottom line. And yet I think the book is persuasive. So if everything that corporation did were only about the bottom line, then different sectors would look more similar than they do. So the particular power of the pharmaceutical industry comes not only from its ability to claim significant share of economic value, but also from its, yes, self-interested, but also not only disingenuous ability to claim non-economic values as well, including, say, care. So, we could quibble with whether this is actually hierarchical in the sense of an unranked list. I mean, surely economic value is in some sense the most fundamental from the perspective of a capitalist enterprise. But there still is something to this effort of pharmaceuticals companies to lay claims on more than economic values both internally and externally, and that the broader social field becomes a site of value extraction, but also of articulations of hope. And so there's this fascinating play in the book on corporations as persons, and really thinking about the etymological roots and embodiment as they claim citizenship rights. So definitely worth a close read for those in the audience who haven't yet had a chance to do so. But one thing that I would kind of note as a potential point for conversation is that sometimes these efforts of pharmaceutical companies do meet mixed success. And I think that the failures might have been mined more deeply or might be mined more deeply in the future. So that is when pharmaceutical companies maneuvers fail economically and fail semiotically. So in the case study about Seraphim in chapter 1, we read about how Eli Lilly was able to lay claim to new patent rights for a pill for premenstrual dysphoric disorder through laying a claim for a new diagnostic category. So after pages of exegesis on patent plays, there's just a minor mention of its relative lack of success. And a final couple paragraphs of that section noting that the company endured a lot of derision for its all too obvious effort to extend Prozac's patent through reinventing fluoxetine for PMDD, and that was ultimately what he refers to as relatively weak. But the short shrift to the failure ignores the broader pharmaceutical landscape beyond Seraphim. So once PMDD came to the fore, hormonal contraception companies also latched onto it, and with far more success. So in the US and the UK at least, hormonal contraception, whether generic or branded, is the go-to cure-all promoted for any ill for women of reproductive age. So that could be acne or heavy bleeding or much more. And it also makes symbolic sense for PMDD because women and clinicians alike tend to understand menstrual issues as hormonal. So this leads to a potential point for conversation. And I think it's interesting to think about it in light of what Brandon was saying about diagnosis, about whether, to bring the Seraphim kind of case into conversation with the fluoxetine among our greedy eating Bengali in the opening vignette. So is the capacity of fluoxetine to be divorced from its associations with the brain distinct to India, or at least is that tie harder to break in the US and the UK? That tie between indication and drug. And more broadly, I wonder whether you would agree or disagree with the suggestion that seems to be implicit that the link between the prescription definition and meaning making among consumers might be stronger in sites like the US and the UK than it is in sites like India. So more broadly still, I'd love to hear more about the uneven material semiotic terrain related to that hierarchical creation of value across transnational fields. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And wow, what a incredible set of interventions and food for thought, also was a major part of my previous book. How will I deal with such riches of insight from you all? Let me try to, I add all of you as spotlights. I don't know what happens then, but just, I think Io had to leave and add spotlight. So yeah, then we're all here. Add, good, okay. Okay, wow, let me think where to start. I mean, again, this is, thanks so much. I mean, for an incredibly close reading also. I mean, actually completely amazed by, as many of you also just pointed out, just what you actually took from the book, which I'm almost like, oh, wow, okay, that was actually in there. Because, yeah, I mean, it's been an attempt to really bring in an awful lot of stuff, right? So I was trying to, I mean, to really focus the whole discussion also in the book on these antidepressants, of course, which I've been working on for a long time, and then to also make it regionally specific to India. But even that would seem like hyper focused, but actually that even just spiraled out and out and out. So it's kind of corporate social responsibility, and what's the difference between habitography and ethnography, and about RDoc and big data. And I mean, it was quite an experience working on this book also, because it's just kind of even like a super tight angle on just how are antidepressants used and made meaning of, the way that Anne also really drew out, like how are they being made meaning of in India, just would bring out just so many different facets and lead me into so many different directions. And also actually, I mean, for me, I was partly surprised that when I kind of put the book together, that the value question, of course, seemed to be the one that really seemed to just work with all of these different angles, right? And to think through that it would allow to, when you start with value, to think of embodiment, to think of corporate social responsibility, to think of the problems that psychiatry has been facing and its failures, and also, I mean, this was so interesting, and also how you pointed out these symbolic failures of the pharmaceutical industry, again, in terms of just, there's a question of value. Again, it's a failure of sorts of bringing out like what the value contribution, the added value, both therapeutically and symbolic, would be of these new medications when they came in. So, that's what I've been trying to do in the book, and again, I'm so amazed by just how you brought out these very, very different perspectives on it. Again, where I thought, I had, sort of that. Also, when you write a book, you think you actually know what's in the book, and now just listening to it, I'm like, oh, okay, that's in the book. So I'm incredibly thankful for you for bringing out these completely different facets there as well. Where do I continue? So Junko, you've been talking a lot about this scaling up of suffering in relationship to global mental health. And again, we're launching this book in the midst of a global mental health conference. So, not all of all of the book in some way relates to global mental health, but I've only actually just have one chapter on it. But of course, like, again, and this was very nice to hear in the talks so far at the conference also, just this, everyone seems to agree also that global mental health is just so much broader, touches on so many more things, that also there's not even like whether we need to look more at culture, but absolutely, but how do we do that? Also just going back to points that Brandon raised, that there's this a real problem, and conceptually, symbolically in psychiatry, to like, you recognize that culture is actually incredibly important, but how do you do that? Like, how do you bring this into practice? And again, I was trying in the book to think this through value concepts, but also this work of the symbolic work that the pharmaceuticals then do on top of that, that's something that actually needs to be brought more into this DSM discourse on what culture is actually meant to do, or what it does. But it's also really important, again, as Junko pointed out, how particularly in global mental health discourse, culture has become something that's seen as really problematic, right? I was also really taken aback by statements, particularly in that Lancet Commission report from 2018, where basically, anthropology and the cultural engagement with these topics was listed as one of the obstacles to better global mental health, right? It's sort of these people who are bringing in too much culture, and culture muddles up everything, and and so that it is so much easier just to reduce culture to stigma or barriers of access, and not actually engage with it. And again, this is of course part of what Junko also pointed out, this global monoculture of happiness. And I'm really happy that you took out this particular section also on the Hindu ideas, and where I've been trying to think further about just again, that there's just such a plurality also of making meaning of what depression, low moods, but also what these drugs are, right? So there's this incredible richness of that I found in India in just like what is this stuff? What is the condition? What are these feelings, and what are the various kinds of treatments and their meaning? You know, that and then also their own take on these fundamental assumptions that are embedded in so much, both in global mental health, transcultural psychiatry, these fundamental ideas of, for example, that true happiness, authentic happiness, is in maximum relatedness to other human beings. And Junko and I've had a previous discussion on that, where Junko actually, where I said, no, really, social relatedness, I would probably think this is the main resource for happiness. And Junko said, no, it isn't. And I love that part of our conversation. But yeah, this was part of the book as well, you know, trying to, and then I go into some fundamental philosophical ideas also that I just, this was another fascinating thing for me working on this book, that you start with, you know, what does this leaflet mean that a particular Indian pharmaceutical company has produced? And then you end up with, what does Heidegger have to say about being in the world? And, you know, it was a really interesting journey as well, which I couldn't really foresee also. I really enjoyed working on this book just because it kind of took me by surprise the whole time as well. And it just sort of seemed that, like, you know, now I need to also answer this question. Now I also need to go into this one. And that's how, you know, sort of it suddenly, you know, it just became so much broader also and so much more complicated. And where I was still trying to, you know, keep it all sort of reined in. And Samit reminds me we have 1 minute left. Maybe just back to you. I mean, some final thoughts or anything you.
Some questions in the chat.
Oh, we have questions in the chat. Maybe we'll just take 1 minute and one from the chat. Can you explain more about how scaling up mental health interventions scaled up suffering? Okay. Well, how did I actually? I mean, this is actually related to partly what I was talking about this morning, which is this unease. I have an incredible unease about so much that's being argued about the relationship between psychopharmaceutical therapies and their economic returns also, right? So this whole idea that, and this is so fundamental, I think, to how the whole field of global mental health has constituted itself, and the policies that's been driving towards is this idea that there are all these poor people, we have the effective therapies, it's only a matter of getting the therapies to those poor countries, and then the problem will be solved. And the intense unease that I have from this is, you know, also living here in the UK, and everywhere you look, and this was this case study that I presented earlier, is just the suffering seems to be increasing all the time. And there were all these patients who've been on various kinds of drugs for a long time, and they are absolutely miserable. And it just never struck me as like, surely, you know, all that's needed is to just hand out those pills and then the problems will be fixed. And indeed, it seems to be almost the inverse relationship often at work. You know, the more you invest, but then the question, of course, is always what kind of investments are being made in this field, right? What is being highlighted? And yes, global mental health has been moving away a lot from psychopharmaceuticals. They've been much more invested in this before, and they're not as invested in this now. Also, you know, all the points that Brandon raised today, and that critique of psychopharmaceuticals is still really valid. But, you know, so the investment was still like, oh yeah, just give them the drugs and then it will be fine. And I think that the evidence contrary to that is just absolutely overwhelming. And in that sense, you know, it's almost like, you know, when you have this push to help people out of their poverty along with psychopharmaceuticals, that seems to be almost scaling up the suffering itself as well. Of course, I'm not sort of, but it's riddled with paradoxes, and things are just, again, what Brandon also said, it's just not been working out in the way you thought it would. It just wasn't meant to be this way. We are not, it's like so many decades later after Prozac and so on, we were not supposed to be in this position now where you just have so many more people suffering when those drugs are supposed to be available. And, that's kind of the conundrum that I'm dealing with. Okay, I think we have to leave it at that. It was an enormous pleasure, and thank you so much for joining, and hope to see you in person very soon somewhere. And
yes,
and
congrats, Stefan. Congrats again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.